Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, June 30th, 2024. Today, we have a fascinating philosophical conversation in store for you. Joining us is our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our current Vice Chairman and Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, and our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. Our returning guest today is Charlie Painter. We were pleased to have Charlie as our guest during the Virtual Enlightenment Salon of June 2nd, and if you haven't seen that one yet, I encourage you to watch it because in addition to a lot of excellent philosophical conversation, it involved some musical demonstrations that I think were quite interesting and quite educational as well. So Charlie is a self-studied, self-producing guitarist, teacher, and band leader based in Madison, Wisconsin. And you can also visit his YouTube channel, which contains various musical recordings of his live jazz performances. I think they are quite well done. And Ben actually got the opportunity to watch Charlie perform in person and even jam with him a bit. So I was quite pleased to be informed of that news. And furthermore, you can access Charlie's music on SoundCloud. So please check out his work if you haven't done so. But the way in which Charlie originally got into contact with me was through watching a debate in which I participated on my friend Andreas Xirtus's YouTube channel, and Andreas had also been a prior Virtual Enlightenment Salon guest, but Andreas hosted this debate in conjunction with Seth Garrett, who is essentially a hard determinist, and we had multiple people on each side of the question of whether free will exists, and I advocated for the existence of free will from a materialist, physicalist perspective. So I was arguing that free will is real and free will is an emergent property of material entities at a particular level of sophistication, namely the level of sophistication attained by the human brain and nervous system and the conscious human mind that emerged from those. And Charlie had some excellent feedback on this debate and on the position that I had articulated. And I think at this point, I will give Charlie the opportunity to express his thoughts on the subject of free will. And I anticipate this will be quite a fascinating conversation. We will delve into free will in depth, and we will delve into related philosophical topics as well. So Charlie, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for having me, Gennady. People call it the free will debate, but I think it's also good to call it the free won't debate. An example that comes to mind is every day someone who is an addict, a drug addict, or an alcoholic, basically every cell in their body is telling them that this substance is basically food for them, that is poison. So on a biological level, it's reversed. The signals have been reversed, and we see this in late stage alcoholism. When people stop eating real food and they basically drink because their body thinks it is now a source of nutrition and food. Every day, these people decide, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to live differently. And that's beyond the realm of perception. Uh, it's not even just long-term planning, it's values. So we don't just choose actions, we choose values, and we choose perspectives. We have the ability to change our perspective on things. It's not just that split second moment that we make A or B, left or right. It's a whole value system that is always in the works. And recently, the Ayn Rand Institute put out a video, kind of riffing off of the Neil deGrasse Tyson conversation with Robert Sapolsky, as a biologist, pretty acclaimed guy, who's a hard determinist. And they used the decision of choosing flavors of ice cream, vanilla or chocolate. And then it just comes down to that decision. And it's much more complicated than that. Because what if I'm on a diet? They said, there's many factors. What if one is light and one is full calorie, but then the one that has more calories is maybe on sale, so I get to save money making the other choice, and then I have to sit here and deliberate. Well, if I eat this ice cream now, I better cut calories later, and I'm not going to have such and such. Like it's a multifaceted thing that has to do with values. So I think free won't is another way to call it. Also, another thing that stands out in the free will debate is the determinists are, all of them that I've heard so far, seem to mention the proof that there is no free will has to do with not being able to choose otherwise. That's how it's mentioned. What does that mean, not being able to choose otherwise? I'm still thinking about that, and I'm not sure what they mean, because obviously no one can choose otherwise than what they did, because they did what they did. So what does that mean, not being able to choose otherwise? When we choose our values and we choose these much more complicated systems of thinking and valuing. So that's something that comes to mind, and I hope we can discuss that and what that defense of determinism is, what it means.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Charlie, for those remarks. And when I debated the question of free will, the other determinist debaters were David Long and a gentleman named Abhishek, who goes by the moniker Curiosity. And it was actually Curiosity who stated that we don't really have the ability to choose otherwise. And to this, my response was, well, even if I make a simple gesture, like I would raise this hand, I could have not raised it. And either course of action would have been consistent with the laws of physics. And retrospectively, you could interpret that decision in light of the laws of physics, and it would be perfectly consistent with them either way. You could interpret that decision in light of my motivations, and you could explain it as, well, he wanted to prove a point, or he had these influences on him, etc. But that doesn't rule out me being able to make a different choice. So I don't see how, from the determinist point of view, just because you could retrospectively explain a given decision, therefore you could prospectively predict what a person is going to do. And it is in that forward-looking vantage point that one finds free will, because I see for myself not just two possible actions, but millions of possible actions, which would all be consistent with the laws of physics and biology and chemistry and me as a material being. I could do any of them, but obviously I'm only going to choose to do some of them.
That makes sense to me. Yes. Also,
Yes,
there's a
indeed.
difference between fatalism and determinism,
Mhm.
and that might be worthwhile to sort out as well.
Yes, and this was emphasized during the debate as well, because the determinists were saying, well, determinism does not imply fatalism. They were saying that essentially just because one's choices are determined does not mean that essentially we're all doomed to some sort of preordained bad outcome. They weren't even ruling out systems of morality or systems of individual responsibility. It just seemed that they would have to do more work philosophically to reach the same outcomes that proponents of free will can fairly readily reach through the idea of individual choice. If we have the ability to choose or not to choose to do something, then we as individuals are ultimately morally responsible for that choice, notwithstanding any influences. Some choices may be easier or harder. I used the example of a young man who became a Nazi concentration camp guard, and he was brainwashed by his society, his government, to believe a lot of heinous ideas. But he still, in the moment of dealing with these prisoners, has some choices. Does he treat the prisoners harshly, or does he try to help them out a little bit? He could even choose to covertly join the resistance if he sees what is happening around him as being profoundly wrong. And I think looking backward, one could judge this young man to be morally responsible for his choices. Indeed, the Nuremberg trials held in 1945 and 1946 applied that framework with regard to the more senior Nazi officials who clearly had a lot of choices about what they could have done or could have refrained from doing. So I think the idea of free will makes it a lot easier to have these frameworks of responsibility. I think the determinists who still want to have these frameworks of responsibility are admirable in a certain sense, in that they realize the importance of these frameworks and they're well intentioned. But I think they're making the job harder for themselves and unnecessarily harder. What do you think about that?
Yes, yes. Well, anything with neuro in the title seems to get a lot of clicks these days. And I think it's a lot of people on the neuroscience end of things that are able to zoom in the furthest and look at the brain and try to make predictions and have people click buttons. And if you can, if your brain decided to, if if things moved in your brain a certain number of milliseconds before you click the button on a choice, that's another part of their proof that they give for you didn't really make that decision because before you chose to click the button, there was already activity in the brain. I mean, it's basically a totally materialistic framing of choice. Um, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, so the idea is that just because our choices have a physical basis in them, clearly we have electrical signals going through our brain and our central nervous system. We have chemicals in our brain that react in certain ways. That means that somehow every action is at least potentially perfectly predictable. This is the idea of Laplace's demon, and Pierre-Simon de Laplace was a French philosopher, mathematician of the 18th and 19th centuries. Brilliant man. He contributed a lot to calculus, for instance, but he had this thought experiment: what if there was a demon who knew the entire configuration of material objects since the start of existence, whatever that might have been? Then that demon could predict every future action and every future behavior by a human. And I don't think that's so simple, because, again, the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry are conditional on certain objects being there in the first place. So, as I pointed out with, say, Newton's first law, an object that is at rest will remain at rest unless acted on by an outside force. Or if an outside force acts on that object, it will be equal to the product of the mass and the acceleration. So those ideas, I think, of conditionality imply that just because all of these reactions are physical doesn't mean that every single one of them is foreordained somehow.
Yes, I would also extend that to there's kind of this phrase biohacking that gets used a lot. So it is clear that there are things happening on a level that we may not be aware of in our body that may have some influence, that definitely has some influence on our behavior and our choices. But we also have this amazing thing called awareness. And our awareness as humans extends beyond the sensation level. It extends into what Ayn Rand called the perceptual level, and it extends to a conceptual level. Um, and we're able to, I just have a hard time thinking that it could be deterministic, that one could figure out how to research and study and look into it and do their own experiments on themselves and retrospect or introspect in both, uh, in order to get to a level where they can control their level of breathing, their pulse, their all these autonomic functions, even through breathing, can be manipulated and changed. I don't know if you've heard of Wim Hof and the Wim Hof method, but basically through controlled breathing and things like this, we can even get ourselves to where, and I don't understand it entirely, but controlling the level of oxygen in our blood and things like that, where we don't even have to take a breath every minute. I mean, we can get it up to 2 minutes or beyond before we even have to take a breath. I mean, that is far beyond, as simple as that is, that seems far beyond the realm of what any other animal that I'm aware of, or insect or lower entity, can perform.
Yes, the human mind certainly has tremendous capabilities. Some of those capabilities require training to unlock, but indeed, certain autonomic responses can be conditioned. And as an example, I essentially cured myself from long COVID using a graded exercise regimen. And my working hypothesis is that long COVID is an autonomic nervous system disorder, where the autonomic nervous system perceives the virus to still be present, or a comparable level of stress to be present in the body. And therefore, it overreacts to any significant stressor, be it physical or mental. It causes the heart to beat faster than it should, or it increases one's breathing rate beyond what would be normal. And the heart and lungs are not damaged. So they're structurally fine, they're functionally capable of normal operation. And what I did in terms of my running, because I was an endurance runner before I contracted COVID, but I had to build back up gradually. I would essentially push the envelope a little bit with each workout. I would target a particular heart rate, even if that meant I had to go very slowly to reach that heart rate. But every subsequent exercise session, I would see some improvement, and I would still target that heart rate, but I would be able to go a bit faster or go a bit longer. And eventually, after about a year, I worked my way back up to the running speeds that I was able to undertake before I contracted COVID. And now my heart essentially behaves normally during my exercise. So that's one example. I think it takes discipline, and values are very important because people need to value their health. They need to value achievement, they need to value competency, and they need to value improving their lives and overcoming adversity if they experience that. And I think all of those orientations are chosen. When the determinists say, well, it's a matter of background or upbringing or what one has read or who one's teachers had been, I don't deny that those are influences. But the influences are not themselves 100% guarantees of what one is going to do. Two people could read the same book and respond in very different ways. And also, if you read a particular book, you have some choices about how you react to that. Oh, what do you choose to take out of that book? How do you choose to essentially process the ideas that that author has written? And all of that, I think, gives us enough freedom. The determinists might say, well, unless it's 100% free will, unless we can choose anything that is within the realm of theoretical possibility, then we are not free, we are constrained. And my argument during that debate was we are free enough for purposes of achieving major improvements to our lives and major improvements to our species conditions through technological innovation, through rational policies, through encouragement of productive behavior where people build, people trade, people don't senselessly destroy or engage in pointless conflicts. And I think it's that fact that our scope of choice is broad enough, it's good enough to achieve our continuing advancement, that the free will position is most powerful and I think important for enabling those kinds of beneficial choices.
Yes, also very commendable, Gennady. You figuring out biohacking, if you will, how to. I don't know if you called it an ultra runner. There's a name for that.
Yes,
Running longer than marathon distances.
that's right. That's right. And I have done 12 ultra marathon races in the course of my life. These days, I focus on shorter distances, so half marathons or less, because the ultra distances, they're more of a test of endurance. They don't so much build up fitness in themselves, they're a demonstration of pre existing fitness. But I do think regular running, say 10 kilometers a day, is an excellent way to build up fitness and maintain it throughout one's life. But I wanted to bring in a comment by Rudy Hoffman, who actually responded very favorably to Robert Sapolsky's books. He said he read both of them and considered them terrific. And those books had an influence on Rudy and made him seriously consider that free will is a total illusion. Rudy says just because we feel like we have free will, that means nothing. We also see that the earth is flat, but it probably isn't. And it's interesting because you mentioned, Charlie, that the Ayn Rand Institute responded to Sapolsky, and I think it may be a good idea to summarize that response. But my response on the comparison with the flat earth idea is that if we see more evidence, we don't contradict our everyday experience with regard to our observations of the earth. Because the reason why the earth kind of seems flat to us is that it's just a really big sphere. And the curvature is so gradual that we don't notice it that much unless we have a really vast unobstructed view. Like if we had an unobstructed view for 100 miles, we could probably observe a little bit of that curvature. But most of us don't have that kind of view. So we might initially perceive the earth as flat, but through our explorations, people have circumnavigated the earth. But even before that, ancient Greek philosophers figured out that the Earth is spherical. We can obtain data that do not contradict our everyday experience at all. They don't say that the way we see the Earth is an illusion. In fact, it's quite useful for us from the standpoint of, say, planning buildings to essentially assume that we're on a flat surface. However, with regard to the claim that free will is an illusion, that really undermines a direct perception of ours in a way that doesn't just add more data, it invalidates what we directly see as being the case, what we directly experience as being the case. And I don't think that invalidation is valid. I think any reasonable theory of how the world works or how the mind works would have to take our perceptions as being what they are. We do perceive the act of choosing, and it's not just an illusion. What science could say is there are chemical and electrical signals involved in it, and it could explain how the brain works, it could explain how the central nervous system works, but we're not thereby the slaves of some other forces just because there is that physical basis. But what do you think about that, and what do you think about Sapolsky's arguments and how the Ayn Rand Institute responded to them?
Yeah, just a couple things quick about your ability to kind of recover from long COVID. I was a cigarette smoker for 15 years, pretty heavy in the last 5 years. And I started running, jogging, just, 5K, not at first. It was just half a mile at first and then a mile. I have exercise induced asthma. I've had it since I was a kid. And again, I would notice kind of on a similar vein, when my heart would get past a certain level, certain speed, that would trigger the response of having the asthma attack. And my biohack was realizing that and just keeping my pace under a certain amount, under a certain speed, I could continue to run further and further without getting that overreaction, getting that asthma attack. And I was able to work it up to 5K. And, I try to do that 3 times a week. Nothing like you do. I've never done a marathon or anything like that. I just call it maintenance running. It's just for general health, to keep my, my weight at a good level and all of that, and my skin and oxygen and my heart and all of that. So yeah, I totally commend you on that, and I can relate. It was hard work. It took a while, but it's totally doable, even if you have asthma and you've had it for a long time, even if you were a smoker and you've done a lot of damage. Some of that is changeable. As far as the debate, it was more of a conversation, I guess, because I think everybody on the panel was a determinist, more or less. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson, he seems fairly in favor of that determinism. He kind of jokingly said to Sapolsky, he said, well, I guess you didn't really have much of a choice then to become a determinist. And I guess the people who aren't going to be on board, Lord save them. I guess we pray for them or something. And they all laughed. And that was a very, very good objection, but he didn't push on it. He didn't really realize the weight of that objection. It was kind of more of mentioned as a joke. And that was something that the Ayn Rand Center elaborated on that more. Let me give an example. If something happens, some event or something, and I have a quick emotional response to it, that may be automatic in a sense that something happened, I perceived it, and I have a quick emotional response. That's true. But where do our emotions come from? And this is something that Ayn Rand, of course, wrote about. Our emotions are kind of a feedback. There's a loop between our thoughts and our feelings. And our emotions, if we introspect, we'll find that our emotional responses that we have to things are based on our values, which are based on our thinking about what we like, what we want, long term, what our values are. of course, the standard of all values, the standard being our life, one's own life is the standard of all other values, Ayn Rand said, which I think is right. But I may not be able to choose that initial emotional response that I get, in the blink of an eye. But I can retrospect, I can introspect, and I can think, was that rational? Was the emotional response that I had, was that really rational? And I can think about that, and I can be like, well, maybe not. That doesn't seem very like, for instance, being jealous about something. That is not a rational thing. Retroactive jealousy is an example, I guess, of that. That means, basically, for people that don't know, that means being jealous of things that happened in the past. So, for instance, having a partner and being jealous about an experience that they had in their past, right? So there's nothing they can do about it anymore. That would be an example of like an irrational emotional response. And people can treat themselves for that. You can introspect on that and realize, yeah, there's really no point in being jealous about things that I have no control over. Perhaps even being jealous of anything, even something I do have control over. That would be my example for that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Charlie. And we have some interesting comments from our viewers as well. Jason Geringer writes, when I think of free will, I think of video games and choose your own adventure books. But I would think even then we still have free will. And indeed, those games and those books are premised on at least some significant extent of free will. Mike Lazine writes, the best books with free will are the choose your own adventure books until you run out of given endings and choices. Well, it is the case, of course, that the author writes the endings in each case for the choose your own adventure books, and the author's perspective will affect the reader's experience. So some authors might think that you have a lot of agency, you have a lot of free will, and so they'll write very different endings based on the choices that you make. Other authors might be trying to make the opposite point, and whatever choice you make in that choose your own adventure books, it ultimately leads to the same conclusion. So to some extent, those books, or indeed the video games themselves, are devices for conveying particular artistic and philosophical visions, and they could be very useful devices for illustrating the concept of free will. But some clever determinist might indeed also utilize them for his or her own purposes. And Alan Crowley writes, we are free enough, indeed. We are constrained by all sorts of things like the visible color spectrum, but we can figure out how to make telescopes and microscopes. And indeed, I think mostly the constraints that we experience are in terms of means and in terms of time frames. So, for example, one cannot just decide that one wants to fly and flap one's arms and jump off of a 5-story building and expect any good result. However, of course, humans, through indeed centuries of trying to understand the laws of nature, have ultimately developed flying machines. Leonardo da Vinci originated certain concepts for flying machines in the late 15th century, but it took a lot of development of physics as well as a lot of tinkering by inventors like the Wright brothers to ultimately get the first powered flight in 1903. And that means that we can actually achieve most, if not all, of the goals that we set our minds to, provided that we deploy the proper means to do so and we have enough time. Of course, one of the foremost goals of the US Transhumanist Party is to greatly extend human lifespans so that we have that kind of time. And if we have a goal that is too far out using our current means, we would live long enough to see those actually efficacious means develop and perhaps contribute to their emergence. So what do you think about that, Charlie? And then we'll go to Jason.
Yes. Well, let's take this as far as it can possibly go, the free will thing. What's as far as we can go on this? Well, the choice to kill yourself. I don't know how many other species have that ability, have that choice. If Ayn Rand said that the standard of all value is human life, and I think this perhaps ties into the transhumanism uh, goal or charter, if you will, uh, if that is the value, the standard of value, and we have a fundamental choice, man is faced with a fundamental choice, and that is to live or not. Is it deterministic? Someone who commits suicide, let's just try to play this out. Is it deterministic that someone who kills themselves had to do that? I cannot. When we take it to that extreme, I cannot in my mind. I'm trying to steel man their position here and think about how that could be determined that somebody would. Even in the most gruesome situations that have been documented, extreme torture, war, starvation, catastrophic circumstances, where yeah, I can't, I still, even then, even when you add everything up, I still can't see how a choice like that is determined. As far as what you're saying, extending life, which I am pro, and that's assuming that there aren't extenuating circumstances that, I mean, I can't imagine that there would be circumstances where it would be rational for one to commit suicide. I'm not saying that. But given that there are, advancements in health, that a lot of these fields are growing fields in pain management, how to live with pain, how to perceive pain, even, is something that people, there's training available. I don't know a lot about it, but people who live with pain on a daily basis, there's certain things they can do to change their orientation to it, which may not be the same as getting rid of the pain. And as far as life extension, I mean, cells die. There are what, 3 ways that cells die: junk inside the cell, junk outside the cell. What else? Cancer, veins getting old, veins and blood, the way our blood is carried, those tunnels, if you will, can break down. So if there's ways that we can repair these things, it makes perfect sense to me. Also, removing brain junk that causes Alzheimer's and memory loss and things like that. If there are ways to upkeep these things, it seems perfectly rational to want to extend life as long as you can, as long as possible.
Yes, indeed. And what you're describing is the damage repair approach that Dr. Aubrey de Grey had articulated back in the year 2000. And the more comprehensive set of damages, he identified 7 types of damage, essentially. Of course, they have multiple subtypes and manifestations. That strategy for addressing all of them is called SENS, or Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. So those are great points. And with regard to suicide, yes, it would be a very bleak worldview indeed if somebody were to seriously assert that a person who commits suicide was predetermined to do that there was no way that that person could have not committed suicide. And the extreme variability in human choices, I think, undermines that potential determinist position, because there are so many people who experience great adversity. Israel Kristall, who was at one point the oldest man alive in the world, he died at the age of 113. He was a Holocaust survivor. And despite being a Holocaust survivor, he went on to become a chocolatier, and he operated a successful candy business for many decades, and then he became the oldest man in the world. So he clearly had motivation to live despite having undergone this horrible experience of being imprisoned in a concentration camp. On the other hand, some of the people who commit suicide are essentially kids from wealthy families who feel a sense of ennui and boredom and lack purpose in their lives. And one wonders if they had just read some good philosophy, or if somebody came along and presented a sufficiently rational argument or a system of meaning to them, could the act of suicide not have been averted? I think it would have definitely been worthwhile to try, but they themselves, too, could have gotten that perspective from a variety of circumstances in their lives. Like, their lives are pretty good, objectively speaking. They may not be perfect. Everyone has issues that they may be dealing with, even people who are well off materially. But still, I think a person in that situation could come to the realization that, wait, a desire for suicide is wildly disproportionate to the actual conditions that one is experiencing. But Jason, I would like you to pose your question as well, if you can.
I was breaking up, but am I back now?
You're back.
Okay, cool. So talking about the games, like the choose your own adventure books, and in video games where you got dialogue you can pick, I can almost maybe see where you could say that's deterministic. You don't have as many choices, but like I used to be a dungeon master and like make old school D&D games, and when you make a game, you don't really have, like, if say the players are in a village, they got the free will to like walk up and knock on any door or whatever. And the dungeon master might not necessarily have anybody living there, but if they choose to do that, then you got like tables where you can roll a dice and you roll up, okay, John Smith lives there, blah, 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 blah. Okay. But also, to steel man the argument, I guess, in an adventure, you're pretty much going after one goal. I mean, if your adventure is to go, get the locket back from the vampire ghoul or whatever, then, that's pretty deterministic. You're either going to do that or you lose, right? So I can kind of see that, but my question is what if you do have like a human dungeon master that can like roll up and make up whatever you want, but you don't have a character. Your character is like God that can do anything. You know what I'm saying? What then? Because then the choices, you don't have choices. You can have whatever choices that are, you can come up with. And then to go even a step farther, if say you believe in God, or just let's assume that, there is this omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing, being, does that being have free will? I mean, how if you can do anything, then where's the limitation in choices in this determination? What do you think?
Well, I mean, we definitely made God in our image. It's the complete opposite of what the scriptures say. I was raised in the Judeo-Christian, studied the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, we couldn't do anything. We didn't celebrate birthdays. We couldn't eat meat. We didn't. I mean, it's impossible almost to study, to follow the Old and the New Testament together without contradiction. Well, I identify as an objectivist or a student of objectivism, and I also try to help people understand it, what I understand of it. And there seems to kind of be two camps of objectivists, and those that are kind of charitable towards religion and Christianity, and they kind of, they don't approve of it, but they don't necessarily feel like ostracizing it or attacking it. And then there's the other brand who are much harder on religion than even Ayn Rand herself, the founder of objectivism. People like Harry Binswanger, I would put myself in that second camp, because converts seem to be the most, intense, converts to anything. So as someone who was raised Christian and all of that, I also studied Islam my freshman year of college. I was praying every day when our twin towers got blasted by planes, flown by suicide bombers. So, not to curb your question too much, but the religion part caught me, and God and all that. I'm in the camp of people who I am very hard on religion. I think we need to get rid of it. I think it needs to be ostracized openly. I think we need to get rid of the idea that we cannot question religion because it's a personal choice, going back to choice. Like, there are all these things that are okay to question and criticize, but we can't criticize religion or people that choose religion as a value system to guide their life because it's a personal choice. I think that needs to go. We need to get rid of that so that we can actually look at it and decide if it's true or not. I do believe that philosophically, the Judeo-Christian, let's call them the Abrahamic religions, I do believe that they are anti-life because they are anti-reason. And for that alone, and basically I also see objectivism as the opposite of Christianity. So I'll throw that out there too. And yeah, that doesn't quite get to your video game question, but I haven't played video games in like 20 years. So.
Well, I will point out a statement from Ayn Rand on religion, and this is from a compilation that the Ayn Rand Institute put together. And Ayn Rand actually had an interview on this with Playboy magazine of all publications in March 1964. And she said that in response to the question of whether religion has ever offered anything of constructive value to human life, qua religion, no, in the sense of blind belief, belief unsupported by or contrary to the facts of reality and the conclusions of reason. Faith as such is extremely detrimental to human life. It is the negation of reason. But you must remember that religion is an early form of philosophy, that the first attempts to explain the universe, to give a coherent frame of reference to man's life, and a code of moral values were made by religion before men graduated or developed enough to have philosophy. And as philosophies, some religions have very valuable moral points, and they may have a good influence or proper principles to inculcate, but in a very contradictory context and on a very, how should I say, dangerous or malevolent base on the ground of faith. So it's actually a very nuanced perspective that she articulated, and she made the distinction between religion as philosophy and religion as faith. And she was an admirer, for instance, of Thomas Aquinas, who was very rigorous in his efforts to integrate the thoughts of Aristotle into the canon of the Catholic Church. And many of Aquinas's contemporaries wanted to reject the Greco-Roman thinkers altogether, and Aquinas was saying, well, wait, there's a lot of value in here, and he articulated an entire system essentially trying to establish compatibility between Christianity and Aristotelianism. And one can question whether there is compatibility, but the net influence of Aquinas's project on how Christianity manifested itself was definitely positive, and Ayn Rand would have agreed with that. So in terms of religion as a philosophy, because it does deal with the same questions that philosophy deals with, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics, I think Rand saw some potential value with that, but she did not see value in faith or belief without evidence, or accepting something that is contrary to reason and to the evidence of one's senses. But Alan Crowley also remarks on the zeal of the newly converted, and indeed the observation that I have had is both people who recently convert to a religion, as well as people who used to be very religious and then become atheists. They tend to have more militancy in their attitudes than people who have held these views for a long time or maybe absorbed them from a cultural context. So people who might be culturally religious, for instance, might not actually be thinking through all of the implications of their religious doctrine. They may be following the religion more from the standpoint of the community that has been established around it, or they like their particular church, they like their priest or their pastor, and they think this is a good individual with wise counsel. Or they see their friends as being of that particular denomination, and they actually see some practical value, like the church often has been a place where business deals have been made or people have formed family ties. And on the other hand, people who have been atheists for their entire lives, like me, for instance, they don't really feel a need to lash out against religion because, at least to the extent that the way in which people practice their religion doesn't bother me, doesn't infringe on my liberty, I'm content to let them believe what they want and let them do what they want. And when religious people ask me, well, isn't there some sort of void that you're experiencing, like the Jesus-shaped hole in your heart or whatnot, I tell them no. I have no idea what you're talking about, because as I was growing up, nobody essentially intertwined Jesus with my efforts to make sense of the world and to understand both what exists and what one should do. So I have a system of metaphysics, I have a scientific understanding of the world, and I have a moral framework that is perfectly fine without any sort of deity. To paraphrase Laplace, when Napoleon asked him, well, where is there room in your system for God? My response would be the same. I have no need of that hypothesis. So what do you think of this idea that perhaps the reaction to religion is also a matter of whether one was in either camp, the religious camp or the atheistic camp, for a long time, or whether one essentially changed positions recently? And interestingly enough, the people who change positions recently tend to be more extreme in their stances.
Yes. Well, I'll get to that. Thomas Aquinas. Question: was he the one who came up with the unmoved mover
I think
justification for God?
that's Aristotle. Aristotle.
Oh, that's right.
Yes. And Aquinas adapted it to Christianity, to be sure. But Aristotle's God was very interesting, because all that Aristotle's God ever does is essentially think about himself or itself, because I don't think Aristotle even personified God. So Aristotle was not of the traditional Greek polytheist conviction, nor could he have been a Christian. And yet Aquinas, of course, adopted Aristotle's arguments and tried to make them compatible with the Christian interpretation.
Sure. That makes sense. Well, I was an existentialist, or I was studying the atheistic French and German variations of existentialism. Heidegger. I mean, it's awful stuff to read. I mean, it's just some of the most difficult, dense stuff I've ever read. Stuff translated from French and German into English. Sartre, being in nothingness. I was into all of that. I was quoting that. And that was in my 20s, my mid to late 20s. So I was an atheist for a long time, or a while, considerable, over a decade, well, almost two, before I got into objectivism and Ayn Rand. and all of that. And I think I'm even more anti-religion having found that than I was before, versus just the idea that, oh, this doesn't make sense. How could this be? Now it's a much deeper, more conscious repudiation of the whole idea of commandments and obedience. Like, these are concepts. Now I understand it on a conceptual level. So I'm against religion on a much more conscious conceptual level, because man is the conceptual animal. Animals don't have, other animals don't have chair, table, transportation. Those are all concepts based on knowledge, and knowledge is hierarchical. And religion says don't think, don't do that. That's what I mean when I say it's anti-reason. Because faith, it tells you to just believe that God works in mysterious ways. And when we look at the examples, like Abraham being told to murder his son, unquestioningly, and not questioning that, eating of the fruit of knowledge, the tree of knowledge, like this is antithesis of science and of reason, and trying to find out what is true using your senses. It's much deeper than that. Commandments, obedience, sacrifice. These are all the tenets of the Judeo-Christian framework. What's the other? Atonement. So, there's forgiveness, and then there's what do you call it? Next step after forgiveness, there's reconciliation. Instead, we have atonement. So now it's like, I need to have my body mutilated. I have to do these things to make myself clean and to make myself good enough for God, for this being. Like, I'm totally against those concepts. We don't need those concepts anymore. And like you quoted correctly, Ayn Rand said it, religion was a primitive form of philosophy. That's right, it's primitive, and it's the year 2024 now, and we're going into space. And if you have enough money, you can actually get into a shuttle and go up there, and you can see Earth from the perspective of space now. William Shatner did that, and he's, what, 90 or so?
93.
93.
Actually spoke with him in February at the Biohacker Expo. His mind is definitely quite cogent. He had a riding accident at the age of 91, so his mobility is a bit limited now, but intellectually, he is definitely far ahead of most 70 or 80-year-olds.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's interesting, too, because I think from the standpoint of what a lot of today's Christians want to accomplish from a moral standpoint, some of their scriptures are actually a hindrance to that. For instance, in many conversations with Christians, I was pointing out the story of Saul and the Amalekites from the Old Testament, and how God, Yahweh, commanded Saul to exterminate the city of Amalek and kill all the men, women, and children, destroy everything, spare nothing. And Saul did most of that, so he committed great atrocities, but he decided to take some of the animals and make an offering to God. And God punished Saul for doing that, because the commandment was kill everything, destroy everything. And Saul was just a little bit milder than that. And I was telling these Christians, well, don't you think you would have an easier time arguing that your religion provides a good moral framework if you rejected that story? If you did not attribute to your God this kind of bloodthirsty behavior? I would understand if you had a genocidal Saul in your Old Testament as a cautionary tale, if you tried to interpret that as a negative example, what not to do. But in this story, it's not possible to interpret it that way, because God commanded Saul to do this. So I think a lot of Christians today are post-Enlightenment Christians. So they have actually absorbed a lot of influences from outside of Christianity, from the Enlightenment philosophers, particularly Christians in the United States who also value the principles of the American founding. And the American founding was not explicitly based in Christianity. Many of the founders were deists, a few were atheists, but even the Christians were soft Christians. So the soft Christianity essentially looks the other way when it comes to these scriptural passages. And I think it's actually a good development, pragmatically, to have religions evolve to, if not reject those elements of their holy books, but to de-emphasize them in some way. The problem is they can't quite reject them altogether because the scriptures are the word of God. Whereas if we have secular documents, whether they be philosophical books or constitutions or documents that set forth a vision of the future like the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, we can amend those as we make new discoveries or as our society evolves for the better. We can codify or articulate our best knowledge, our best moral understanding at any given point in time. Whereas the moment you say that something is unchallengeable, that it's a dogma, that it's a holy book, that becomes problematic. And that doesn't mean people can't go forward with that understanding. Again, just like with determinists who want structures of individual responsibility, they may have good intentions, but the presence of such dogmas makes it harder for them to act on those good intentions. Nonetheless, as a person of goodwill, I believe it's important to still work with those people to bring out those good intentions to a greater extent. So it's more of a practical case. If they're trying to achieve something that aligns with our values, we should still welcome that, even if we reject the foundation on which they're trying to build that. So I wanted to also bring up a comment on William Shatner from Rudy, because he spoke with Shatner at a biohacker conference about cryonics, and he said he would think about it, and Rudy is still waiting with bated breath for that. Now, Rudy also asks, does anyone else agree that the situation in Gaza refutes the morality of religions pretty clearly? So that's an ongoing conflict, but Charlie, if you want to venture into your thoughts on that and whether you think that's an illustration of what you've been discussing, please feel free.
Well, I do know the conflict going on in Gaza has a historical, there's a lot of history to it, from when the British partitioned the area to, a lot has happened through the decades, as far as the two-state solution, if that's possible. I think a two-state solution is inevitable. That has to actually, we have to have Jews and Muslims living in the same areas, ultimately. That needs to somehow be achieved, which means, I believe it has to do with eliminating the radicals, and I will call them Islamo-fascists. There are also extremist Jews as well, but I've heard figures from 70 to 76% of the population of Gaza are pro-Hamas, if not, supporting members or supporting the ideology of it. That gets tricky because you have a government. I mean, Hamas is a government. It's not just a military. It's the government system. Because to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, they were voted into power through democratic elections by an overwhelming majority, Hamas.
They were, and then they
So-
shut down all future elections. I think they were voted in 2006, and then they prohibited
it was a
people
plurality. But then, yeah, they took out their political rivals and then haven't had elections since. So, you know, half of the people in Gaza never voted because they're still too young yet. So then it's also that makes it hard to say what, you know, the real population thinks too. It's a super tough situation. You know.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I wonder if the voting age is higher than the age of enlistment in the Hamas army, because they recruit kids as young as 13 years old, to my understanding, and they also consider a child to be you're a child until after the age of 19 or the age of 19. So when they say how many children were killed, of course, that statistic could be warped by, yeah, well, Hamas has militants that are 13 years old, as young as 13 up to 19. How old do you have to be to vote? I mean, so I don't know those. I don't know.
Right. The problem with the Hamas, with the thing over there is, if you go back in history, right, and there's so much stuff that has happened on both sides that no matter which side you're on, if you were to go back and start cherry picking data, you can make a good case on both sides. But it's when you put all of the information together and realize all of the different, you're like, whoa, this is just complicated. You know,
I don't think there's a moral equivalency. I will disagree, or I'm not sure if that's kind of what you were implying.
Well, I know. I ain't saying there's a moral equivalency. I'm just saying that if somebody wanted to like make a biased case and cherry pick data, you know, like for the pro Hamas side, there is some stuff they could pull out and, you know, make what sounds like a good case. You know what I mean? But again, it isn't until you realize there's the both, you know, it's super complicated. Like, you know, I don't know, the March of Return, you know, there'll be people saying that this is when there was like this protest where they was all gonna like storm the border or, you know, and go back to their homes, right? And there'll be people saying it was a peaceful protest, yet there was Hamas inside of the crowd, you know, you know, and when the UN or whoever it was, ICJ, did the evaluation of that, they judged it as a policing event and not as like an armed conflict. So then somebody that's
to my not
pro Hamas is going to take that and be like, whammo, the ICJ or whoever said there was.
Seems like Jason is cutting out, unfortunately. But I think his main point was that somebody who wanted to make a biased case for Hamas could find enough evidence of unjust acts. And Alan Crowley writes, the tit-for-tat feedback loop is strong in this conflict. Ben writes in our internal chat that an eye for an eye makes the world blind. And I think this speaks to the idea of cycles of violence and how do we stop them? How do we make sure that in the future you don't have events that radicalize people on either side? I think, Charlie, you pointed to a two-state solution as a possible way to address that, but getting rid of people who intentionally want to provoke these hostilities is important, because Yahya Sinwar, the military leader of Hamas, who essentially orchestrated the October 7th attacks, wanted them to spark a cycle of violence and massive retaliation from Israel, because he knew that the massive retaliation would lead to civilian casualties, and civilian casualties would lead to global outrage and declining support for Israel. Now, prior to October 7th, 2023, Israel had concluded the so-called Abraham Accords with multiple Middle Eastern countries and was on the verge of a major agreement with Saudi Arabia. And if that had been achieved, then a lot of the tensions in the Middle East would have dissipated, and the militant leaders of Hamas would have lost a lot of support from the other, let's say, more conventional governments of Arab countries who might have wanted perhaps to normalize economic ties with Israel, normalize diplomatic relations, and not be kind of in a standoff with Israel. So Yahya Sinwar wanted to essentially radicalize the Arab side in order to entrench Hamas's hold on power. And he very intentionally made a gamble. The gamble is he's playing with his own life and with the lives of the Hamas hierarchy, certainly the Hamas fighters, many of whom are now in hiding. And certainly he doesn't care at all about the lives of the Gaza civilians because he just used them as sacrificial fodder. And he was hoping that Israel would kill as many of them as possible. Now, my problem with the way Benjamin Netanyahu is acting is that he is in some ways just as cynical, because he knows that during wartime, the population tends to unite around a leader. And his government has been beset with allegations of corruption. I think many of them have a genuine basis in fact. In fact, he had been removed for office once for corruption already, but he won another election. And on the other hand, the Israeli people are quite displeased at how long it's taking to liberate the more than 100 hostages that still remain in captivity. And it seems to me Netanyahu is intentionally dragging this war without concluding it, and even threatening to open up additional fronts so that he continues to stay in power. So neither Hamas nor Israel really want to conclude this war, even though peace would be the best option for everyone involved. And liberating the hostages sooner rather than later would be the best option as well. I have said before that I think human life is the foremost priority, and the lives of these hostages should definitely be prioritized over dealing destruction. But I don't think Israel's current approach is conducive to that. Oddly enough, I think the Biden administration is actually doing a fairly good job in trying to pressure a peace settlement, but they're falling short in terms of actually convincing either side of any sort of viable peace deal. I do commend them for trying, though. And I have to say this as someone who has criticized Biden a lot. But it seems to me that some negotiated solution would be better for liberating the hostages and at least taking them out of harm's way and removing that element of complexity from the conflict. But that is my view. And on the subject of religious fanaticism, Hamas would not have perpetrated the October 7th attacks were it not for Islamic fundamentalist militancy motivating those actions. I don't see how a secular regime could have done that. But Charlie, any thoughts that you might have on any comments that have been made thus far, I think would be interesting.
Yes, there's a lot there to work with. Well, first off, to my understanding, the Palestinians have rejected every two-state solution. I want to say going back to the 50s, almost every decade, there's been an offer on the table and they have rejected it. So you can only have peace with people who value life and reason. And I do believe that this conflict between Israel and Gaza is about values, and it's a battle for Western values. Values like, can I be an atheist and live in your country? Can I be a homosexual? Can I reject Islam and live? Can I reject the prevailing religion of the area and live peacefully? Israel is a home to every religion. Israel is a home to every creed. People from all, it's a tiny place as we understand it, right? It's like 9 million people all crammed into a place, smaller than New Jersey? They're welcoming of talking about being pro-peace. I mean, Israel doesn't want these conflicts. Another point is that the atrocity that happened on October 7th has still not been renounced, to my knowledge. That would be an important thing to do in moving forward and trying to gain some form of moral clarity in this. It has not been renounced. It's pretty much been forgotten by a lot of people even discussing this topic. That started a war. And we could also talk about, what does war mean? And what is the goal when you are in a war? What does that mean? Is the point of being in a war to win the war? I would think it would be. Is tit for tat is that even a rational thing when you're in war? And I do believe that people who start the war, they have a certain responsibility, and there is retribution that is rational. Is it life per life? Is it that Hamas kills 20 people, and then if Israel kills 21 people, then they've overdone it? I don't think so. I think if you start a war, you are responsible morally for the deaths of the civilians that accompany that. In anything that it takes, any hostages that die are Hamas's fault after they take the hostages. And I'll make an analogy. If I take somebody hostage with a gun, and a policeman arrive, and they accidentally shoot the hostage instead of me, whose fault is that? It's my fault. It's actually not even the policeman's fault. It's my fault, the person taking the hostage. That's how I view that, in a rationally moralistic way, morals that come from rationality. So I don't think we're even really talking about the heart of what this is. Israel stands for Western values. It stands for science. The cutting edge medicines are made in Israel. People there just want to exist. They just want to live there and, freely choose their values, their value systems. Whereas in Gaza, I don't think it's a choice to be a homosexual, or I don't think somebody can live there with value systems that are, at least, vocally, can live there peacefully. So those are radically different idea systems at play there. And of course, Islamofascism, and they're against Western values. They're not just against Israel. They don't just want to kill all the Jews. They don't want any Jews to live there. They don't want any Jews in Gaza. And Ariel Sharon took all the Jews out of Gaza, and I think it was 2005. So this was not a retributive act, what happened on October 7th, which started this war, which makes them morally culpable for the casualties, the civilian casualties. And I do believe the civilians also are responsible. I know this is not a wildly popular position, but they are responsible. The ones who do not surrender to Israel and renounce this regime, I think there is a responsibility there, going back to the free will example you posed earlier of a Nazi guard and living in a situation where the majority of people around you are for destroying, extincting a group of people. So
yes, thank you, Charlie. And we have some viewer comments. Daniel Tweed says, if martyrdom is instant promotion to glory and a pension for your surviving family, that is a formula for endless terror, and that is what Hamas has set up in Gaza. And Rudy Hoffman says that Charlie may be right about this. Islam is actually worse than Christianity for humanistic Western values. These people are literally trying to bring back the Dark Ages, and we must not allow this. He also says, well, the best of Israel stands for Western values, and Charlie is right that equivalence does not exist here. Mike says he agrees with Charlie, but he also says the problem is Netanyahu and his administration in terms of how the war is being waged. I do think, from the standpoint of the Palestinian civilians, there are a lot of them that one can sympathize with because they're put in a very difficult choice. So let's say they don't approve of what Hamas has done, but they're stuck in Gaza for whatever reason. No other country will accept them. They might have tried to flee to Egypt or Jordan, but those countries aren't particularly eager to take Palestinian refugees. And then they're stuck in an area where the safe zone keeps contracting and keeps changing as well, because Israel does try to set up humanitarian corridors and tell Palestinian civilians, okay, you need to evacuate to this place now. But then perhaps a few weeks later, they also want to go into that particular place because militants are hiding there. And likewise, if some of these Palestinian civilians decide they want to surrender to Israel, for instance, the Israeli military might be suspicious of this because they might think, well, what if there are some Palestinian suicide bombers there or some Hamas militants there? What if not all of these civilians are who they seem? And a lot of the Hamas fighters wear street clothes. And on the other hand, there could be some preemptive killing, and there has been on the part of the Israeli military. They killed 3 hostages who were trying to surrender, for example, and this could have been avoided. So I think there is a case for prudence and restraint in terms of tactics, even if we could make the moral argument that if there is collateral damage, it's the fault of Hamas. Nonetheless, it would be wise for the Israeli military to implement protocols to minimize that collateral damage because of the effects that it's going to have, because of how the rest of the world will react to it, how the support for Israel will diminish, and how Israel's own ability to reach its objectives may be curtailed by this. So those are some thoughts, but it's not an easy situation. In my view, it's a harder situation to resolve than, say, the war in Ukraine, because Putin, for all of his very, let's say, reprehensible motivations, is a secular leader, and he can be reasoned with, and he can, I think, be persuaded to stand down under certain conditions. Whereas Hamas can only be negotiated with instrumentally. Ultimately, there needs to be achieved a freeing of the hostages, and after that, there needs to be a way to get rid of the Hamas power structure. And that is not easy to do. Either of those objectives would be very challenging to accomplish. But if Rudy wants to know whether there's an official Transhumanist Party position about this, no, there intentionally is not, because we have members whose views span the entire spectrum. So I cannot ask our members to take any singular position on foreign policy. We want to have these discussions and debates, though. I think it's important to openly talk about these issues. But Rudy also says, as usual, great comment and observation by Daniel and Gennady. Thank you very much, Rudy. Now I wanted to open up the conversation for Ben and Art Ramon to ask questions to Charlie in the last half hour that we have here. So Ben, please go ahead.
Thanks for being here again, Charlie. I'll get away from Gaza. This is one that I feel might be interesting for the free will determinism. How does the butterfly effect play into free will and determinism, and maybe even include how you define that in your answer?
Can we quickly define what the I've heard of it before, but
Yes.
I want to make sure I know what it is.
So essentially the idea is small events that may seemingly be insignificant at first could have large repercussions. And the idea is a butterfly flapping its wings on the other side of the world could cause a hurricane, say in the Atlantic, because the flapping of the wings could trigger some sorts of essentially processes that eventually, over the course of numerous events, will result in a massive weather system. So the idea is a small event could have huge consequences, or I think there's this common, let's say, story or poem that essentially implies, for want of a nail, the kingdom was lost, because that nail was used in a horseshoe, and that horseshoe was for a horse, for a messenger who had to deliver an important message to a battle, and the messenger couldn't arrive on time, and so the kingdom was lost. So I think Ben was asking, what do you think about the idea that very small events could have huge consequences, and maybe a choice that a person makes could affect world history to some extent that that person couldn't possibly anticipate, or at least affect that person's own life, like choosing to be in a particular place at a particular time?
For the individual, it's going to be a different answer than if you're talking about like making a societal or a larger macro kind of change. One thing that comes to mind is, most of us hear what the celebrities in our culture think, whether we want to or not. It's just kind of in the water supply. It's all over. You're in the checkout line at the store, and you see the covers, and it's, for some reason, people value what non-experts think, or not even think, just say. Maybe they haven't even thought about it. They don't even have any expertise. I think most people are pragmatists, and I think that is why celebrities choose not to comment on a lot of issues and things, like about free will, for instance, or free markets. And so a little thing would be just, if a couple celebrities were willing to risk their fame and popularity to take a stance on something and try to back it up, that would have I think that would make a lot of influence. But as it turns out, like I said, most people are pragmatic, and they don't want to take a stand on anything, because then their number of options decrease, and they want to keep their number of options open. So then they just kind of they kind of like Trump. They just agree with everybody. They'll just say, sure, you got a perspective. You could be right there. You have an opinion. I have an opinion. Everybody does. And so we don't really see these people who have the microphone, who are in the mainstream, taking strong positions about things like the topics we're discussing today. And I think that would make not huge, but I think it would make a bigger impact on society than just, trying to find the Transhumanist Party and join, our live stream. I mean, that's great. But if a celebrity joined this live stream and was talking about free will and religion, that would probably blow up, right? It would probably make a bigger impact. So that just comes to mind.
Yes, indeed. So perhaps the celebrities' expressions of these ideas could be more influential than our expressions, unless we can find a way for our expressions to make it into mainstream public discourse through some direct or indirect chain of events. But I have also wondered sometimes, in regard to the butterfly effect, is it the case that a given action can, especially if it's a minor action or seemingly minor action, radically alter the future course of events? Or would there be other corrective actions, essentially, that would steer that course of events back toward what it would have been were it not for that particular action? So let's say the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina did not succeed for whatever reason. Maybe the weather was different on that particular day, and it wasn't conducive to them flying. or maybe they didn't have the right kind of bolt in their aircraft, and the aircraft ultimately failed, even though it would have been a sound design otherwise. Would it have been the case that somebody else would have invented a workable aircraft shortly thereafter? Or could human history have been radically changed if we had to wait, say, another 15 years before somebody actually achieved powered flight, which would have been after World War I, for instance? So World War I would have looked differently. And I don't have an answer to that question, but it has been a curiosity of mine. Do you think that a given small-ish individual choice could be sufficiently influential to really affect the course of history? Or are there enough other influences, even if that choice is made one way or another, that would lead the outcome to look kind of sort of the same on a macro scale?
I mean, I think just one person, depending on who that person is and what they want to do, deciding to read Ayn Rand could change, maybe not change the world, but just think about our leaders. If our political leaders and our thought leaders, if you call them that, but I don't really see them as thought leaders. If one of them decided to, read the virtue of selfishness, for example, what that could do. I mean, it was picking up a book that changed me, right? Made me want to throw the book against the wall, kind of thing. It's just wow. So even something as small as just reading a book versus not reading a book, depending on whether it's a good book, could make a difference. And if people who have lots of power and influence picked up those books, it could make a big difference.
Yes, indeed. So from the standpoint of a decision intellectually influencing an individual and that person's further development, further actions, further influence upon the world, those kinds of choices can be quite powerful. Yes, thank you. And I hope that the same can be said of our virtual enlightenment salons, that the discussions here will influence some people to live their lives a bit differently, a bit better, to see some options that they might not have seen, to affect positive change in ways that they might not have known to be possible. So now I would like to ask Art Ramon if he has questions or comments for Charlie.
Recently there's been this debate online about women choosing the bear over men if they were lost in the woods or something. And that's been pretty popular and contentious on social media. And, they're saying we have the free will, we're going to choose the bear because men are dangerous. But yet recently there was this murderer in Florida, Wade Wilson, who killed 2 women. And he's, kind of handsome. He's tatted up like, Jared Leto, the Joker. And all these women on social media are just in love with him. They're just making all these comments how they're just in love with this murderer who killed 2 women. So it's kind of thrown a wrench into this debate that's been going on in social media about women choosing the bear. So, and that's been kind of in the past. You've had a lot of women who fall for Charles Manson. And when Charles Manson got married in prison, Richard Ramirez and these other killers. And there's a certain type of women who are just biologically drawn to these dangerous men because somehow they feel that reproductively that's a successful strategy for them. So what are your thoughts? Have you heard of this choosing the bear debate? And have you heard of Wade Wilson?
I think I did read over it briefly. It didn't really grab me a lot. It seemed kind of like a glass half full. Not a good view of the world, I would say. Not a benevolent view of the world, I would say. More of a malevolent view of the world and of man. What about the men who save women from attackers? What about the men who, hear that something is going wrong next door or upstairs, and they go and they knock on the door and they say, what the hell's going on here? And some woman is being assaulted or, worse. So what about them? They don't, that kind of stuff doesn't make the headlines. We hear about all the awful things. There's a name for this type of bias. I don't know if it's just called negative bias, but we're tuned to threat. That's why we have bear mace and we research these kind of things before we go camping. And there's all these ways of hanging your food and stuff to keep bears away. I mean, we are sensitive to threat in general. I tend to think that women are a little more on that program, a little more sensitive to threats and danger in general than men, in my experience. I can't back that up with any science, but it intuitively seems right. I think women are looking for threats, scanning the environment for that kind of thing more than men on average. Of course, men commit 90+% of the violent crimes. So it's not irrational that women would be, more on the lookout for those kinds of things. As far as women choosing a bear over men, I mean, that's just silly, right? Because a bear is stronger than any man, for one, or even group of men, and you'd be lucky to have your life, to keep your life after a bear attack, I would think. Just those 3-inch claws that they have. What's the percentages on people surviving bear attacks, right? When we bring reason to bear, it kind of falls apart, these kinds of things, right? Because your chances of surviving a bear attack versus a man assaulting you or overpowering you, I think the odds would be worse, even though there are more men doing that than there are bears attacking people. So I'm not sure quite what the logic was in the initial thing that would say that a woman would choose a bear over it.
Yeah, it's like a statement that, a lot of women just feel that men are just toxic. And this whole dynamics of the sexes, recently in relationships has just gone, completely toxic. I think part of it might have come up with that other social media guy, Tate. Be the misogynist. So, it's kind of been interesting to be tuned into these social debates.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's certainly toxicity on both sides of that particular culture war, but I'm in agreement with Mike Lazine when he says he thinks this whole bear thing is misandrist. Imagine if some man used some example dealing with women not being able to be trusted in this kind of categorical way. And Rudy wonders, is bear a synonym for aggressive men here? No, this is referring to a literal bear in that particular context. Now, Daniela Gazabara writes, bears are predictable, humans are not. One always wonders what another human is thinking or feeling with a bear, However, I think this could be brought back to the free will discussion, because humans have free will. So humans can choose to act in a very decent manner, or in the case of a woman in the woods, in a protective manner, or just leaving her alone, or they can choose to be aggressors. But I think, given that humans have free will, there is some non-negligible probability that a random man encountered in the woods would be a decent man. Whereas with a bear, that the bear is probably going to be hostile if that bear is too close. It's possible to sneak around the bear, avoid the bear, not trigger the bear. I understand that. But most humans are actually fairly decent. If they weren't, our civilization would collapse. If even 1% of humans were imminently likely to attack one, if they wanted to do that, our civilization would collapse. There wouldn't be enough police officers, security guards to prevent those kinds of terrible behaviors. So chances are more than 99% of men whom one randomly encounters in the woods are going to be safe. It's that maybe 0.01% of men that one has to worry about, and one could take sensible precautions. I'm not against having, say, pepper spray or other protective devices. I'm not against not instantly trusting strangers. And I think there are many ways in which people have adopted heuristics to try to figure out in advance who might be safe and who isn't so safe. But yes, misandry is such an unfortunate aspect of the contemporary culture wars, and generally making stereotypes that are hostile to either gender is counterproductive. It's like the cycles of violence that were referred to before, in a much milder way, of course, because we're not seeing massive killings of one gender by another gender, but the mistrust, the toxicity should all be transcended. And rational individualism, I think, is the way to transcend that. So Ayn Rand, of course, was a great proponent of rational individualism, and indeed a trailblazing female philosopher who defied a lot of the stereotypes of her time about what women were or were not capable of doing. But she was perfectly fine with just being herself, being an individual and articulating her values. Now, we have some other great comments as well. So Jason writes, so for the butterfly effect thing, the wing flap only starts a chain of events. So all of the steps along the way would have causation as well. Yes, that is what that hypothetical implies. There would be causation, and there would be the possibility of other events to kind of interpose themselves anywhere along that chain of causation. So something could happen to interrupt that chain. And to a certain extent, maybe the butterfly hypothetical is a bit fanciful because it presumes that these events would just accumulate and there wouldn't be any contrary events anywhere along the way to kind of diffuse that dynamic, so to speak. And on the butterfly effect, Mike Lazine writes, nobody will ever know, Gennady. There are those who do believe that any choice that is not made in this universe has been made in another, and so on. These are all multiversal theories. I have never been persuaded of the existence of a multiverse where a different choice had actually been made. I do think ultimately we make specific choices, and those choices then set the stage for other choices, and they may create certain possibilities and they may foreclose on others. I don't think that universes in which other choices had been made actually exist. I think they are thought experiments, essentially. They're constructs within our minds, but I don't think there's an actual multiverse. But Charlie, do you have any thoughts on the multiverse hypothesis?
This all depends about our definition of what a universe, right? That's a concept again. So Ayn Rand's view, definition of the universe, I ascribe to that. The universe means all of the things, not limited to any particular thing. It's all of the things. So when you say multiverses, it's kind of incomprehensible to me. Kind of like when people say, oh, God made the universe. But so that's saying God is somehow outside of the universe. But if the universe is all the things, then that's a contradiction. I would also like to know if this person believes in free will or not, who posed the question.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because Mike has made some comments in the chat that I could interpret as being somewhat skeptical of free will. But Mike, I will let you say for yourself, do you think free will exists at least to some extent, or are you more of a determinist? I would also encourage anybody who is interested in this discussion to read my treatise, which is called A Rational Cosmology, in which I also address the definition of the universe. And I agree with you, Charlie. The universe is everything that exists. It is not a thing in itself. It is a convenient collective designation to encompass every single thing in existence, the things we know about, the things we don't know about as well. So I do struggle in conceiving a multiplicity of those universes, each of which is everything that exists. But in some of those particular things could be different. They could have gone in different ways. Conceptually, that's just difficult as a coherent concept. Now, I also wanted to bring up an interesting comment from Rudy, and I know you have some thoughts on this as well. Ayn Rand and objectivism are beautiful and powerful. In his mind, it is regrettable that many who maintain these, in his view, libertarian points of view are less than optimal humans. And I think Rudy may be discussing some of the chaos that happened, for instance, with the Libertarian Party in recent years, where there has been a lot of infighting, factionalism, just pure, let's say, devolution in regard to the behavior of some prominent libertarians. And indeed, they almost failed to nominate a candidate at their convention. About 40% of them voted for none of the above, which would have meant essentially a capitulation to Donald Trump. But I know that Ayn Rand did not consider herself to be a libertarian either. And some objectivists would very emphatically say that they are not libertarians as such, even though many libertarians were strongly influenced by Ayn Rand. But they would say there are some key differences that perhaps prevent objectivism from being able to be painted with the same brush as libertarianism. So what are your thoughts on this?
I love this question. If I got $1 every time somebody called me a libertarian or said that Ayn Rand was a libertarian, God, I'd be doing pretty good right now. Yeah, libertarianism is a big tent, and some might call it a big mess. There are anarchistic factions within libertarianism. There's pacifistic, kind of anti-war on principle factions. And that's because the Libertarian Party and libertarianism is not a philosophical movement. It is a political movement. And of course, politics, if we go in order, and this is what Rand said, we have metaphysics, what exists. We have epistemology, the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Can we know anything, right? And then we have ethics, so that's the third floor. And then we have politics is at the fourth floor. So libertarianism is approaching this not from a firm, solid basis in reason as man's only guide to knowledge. And that's why we need capitalism. That's why capitalism is, or free markets, laissez-faire capitalism, why that is the only moral social political system. So they're approaching it at the level of freedom for freedom's sake, freedom to, you can be a Catholic and be a libertarian. You can be for, a 40-year-old man having sex with a 15-year-old. That's there are libertarians. I'm not saying all, but there are libertarians who hold views like that. There are libertarians who are for a central bank that I've met. There are libertarians who are for vaccine passports and things like that. That's the big mess part of it. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they couldn't have an over 50%. Trump was at the Libertarian convention. I heard he did get booed, but then of course, the next week, Trump makes statements like, "Oh yeah, I'm for getting rid of income tax. We'll just have tariffs. We'll just use tariffs, and that's how we'll pay." That's how our founding fathers did it. And of course, I disagree with them on that point. I'm against all tariffs. This is something Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump have in common, of course. They're both very pro-tariff. And Biden. The reason your iPhones are so expensive is because of tariffs. They'd probably be, I don't know, who knows, $300, $400 without the tariffs. Look at the baby formula shortage that happened earlier this year under Biden. It took him, over a week to address that. That was because of tariffs too. Tariffs on shoes, tariffs on, all of that. Now, so that's not even a uniform. There's not even a uniform position, to my knowledge, of libertarians on that. So that's one of the reasons why objectivism is very distinct and from libertarianism, and why Ayn Rand did not want any association with libertarianism.
Yes, thank you for those remarks. And indeed, objectivism is a very specific philosophy in terms of its contents, and libertarianism has more of the big tent approach. Now, I think sometimes a big tent approach is the only way to go if one wants to achieve particular goals with enough of a critical mass of support. But I do wonder sometimes if a more philosophically grounded, philosophically anchored big tent could be possible. And that's what we're trying to achieve with the Transhumanist Party. But we have a bit of humor from our friend and 2024 vice presidential candidate, Daniel Tweed. So first he asks, why is the Libertarian Party the party of principle? Because there's no interest. Oh, that's funny. And then he says, objectivists make the best security guards because they are always checking their premises. Well, thank you, Daniel, for that comedic interlude. And we have about 2 minutes remaining in our salon. I think we had a good, robust discussion of free will and a few other areas where objectivist philosophy definitely has had significant things to say on religion, on libertarianism, on the philosophical hierarchy that you mentioned. We discussed some current events as well, so the application of philosophy to ongoing situations. What remarks would you like to conclude with, Charlie, in terms of how would you encapsulate this discussion, or is there anything else that you would want to say today?
Well, I enjoyed this very much. I appreciate the having a plan beforehand of topics to discuss, but there were also emergent things that popped up, questions and such, and that moved the conversation in other areas that were also exciting to explore. And yeah, I enjoyed myself, and I would love to come back.
Excellent. Well, if we want to have another stimulating philosophical conversation, we know where to find you, Charlie. And I think our viewers enjoyed this as well. It is indeed what our virtual enlightenment salons strive to accomplish. We want to discuss these kinds of issues thoroughly and thoughtfully and make connections to other disciplines or events that are ongoing in the world, because philosophy has practical significance. It has significance in terms of how we live our lives as individuals and ultimately what becomes of the world at large. So thank you very much to Charlie. Thank you to our outstanding audience, as always, with your great questions and comments. Thank you to our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers. I hope that we can all live long and prosper.